Government of India. We are all here definitely to listen to Professor Rao, but I think let's also have our own, what do you call, the inputs on that. Professor Rao would also get to know what the participants think about this. And so we have two questions here, which I think I request Sudhir. Sudhir, if you can just show the first question on the poll, you all will be able to see that on the screen. And we request you to all participate. So the question that you are able to see on the screen is, will the government's COVID-19 fiscal stimulus package provide enough boost to the economy? And I think the participants have started responding. Let's, oh, that's great. It started with majority of the people are, no, I don't want to reveal the response right now. I don't want to influence your response. I'm very happy to even share with you that we have a great participation registration this time. Almost 250 and more participants have registered. Most of them would be in the queue of registration and joining in. So meanwhile, we'll also wait them.
Yeah, sure.
Sudhir, you may just decide when to end the poll when all the participants are able to.
Yeah, sure, I'll do.
Give their response. I mean, I leave it up to you, Sudhir. We have some 80% people voted so far. Yes. It's fluctuating because more people are joining and they're able to read that.
It'll be interesting to know their response after the talk.
Yeah, that was the whole purpose of putting it here in the beginning.
And then you can see whether the talk had any impact at all.
Yes, yes, no.
I can run that after that. So I'm sharing the result of first one.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I think all the participants will be able to see the results. 66%.
So there is some Rangarajan who wrote something. Hi Rangarajan, how are you?
Oh, that message would have come to you, sir.
Yeah. No, this is, yeah.
Okay, oh, great. So 66% of the participants believe that this may not be able to boost the economy. And let me also share that the participants, we have a varied diversity. We have undergraduate management and economics students. We have our MA economics, MA economics students from other universities, and we have faculty members, researchers across the globe. I mean, we also have some of the researchers from outside India. So with this kind of a mix of the people who have given a poll here, before, I think, Sudhir, we can just wait for a minute before we move on to the next poll. I request all the participants to kindly register on the Zoom from your name, with your name instead of the mobile name. So we will be able to identify when it is a question answer going on. And also I request all the participants to keep the mic on the mute so that there is a less disturbance while the conversation is going on. The plan as of now we have is that for initial part, Professor Rao will share his views, and after around 6 o'clock, we'll begin with the question answer. But I request you that at a point or at a moment, whenever you have your queries or questions, comments, please keep putting it on the chat box, because we are taking those content and we will use those questions when we start with the question answer round. So at any point on the conversation, you may please text that, type your questions in the chat box. I think we are good to go with the second poll, Sudhir. Would you please run that?
Yeah, I've done that. people can
Yeah,
call.
so the second question is, in designing the stimulus package, focus should have been on which sector? So what is your view? Oh, it's all started before I actually finished reading the questions. The people have started responding. It's interesting. And this is where we actually see the stakeholder analysis perspective. You know, each segment of the economy will have their own preferences. That's the beauty of the diversity. We already started receiving comments. Thanks, Vanikanta. We'll keep noting these comments here. We're taking we are taking a record of this. 74% people have so far voted. While we're doing this exercise of poll, just one small announcement I wish to make. Professor Rao has joined us from Bangalore, and he was just mentioning while we were having conversation that he might experience a power cut. However, there's a remote possibility. But if that happens, or if he'll be able to join us immediately. So not to worry about it. But we may continue with our discussions. I think he said that he won't take more than 4 or 5 minutes. And we also cross-finger that there's no power cut today and there's no Wi-Fi disruption, the internet disruption today, sir. You have been in the meeting since morning, as you said.
Yeah, in the morning it was amazing. There was no power cut.
That's great. So we wish.
Professor Himani, should I end this and then?
I think 76% voted. Yeah, we can. Or
I'll share the result.
Let's go ahead. Yeah. Okay. So the majority is for laborers, migrants, and unorganized workers. I'm sure, Professor Undi, I can see a smile on your face. Professor Undi, let me also, it's the right moment to introduce Professor Jimal Undi here. She is a professor of economics and public policy at Ahmedabad University. And she is also the program chair for our MA economics program. I think the time where we've all gathered here to really discuss about whether these economic package or what we call fiscal stimulus, whether it has really have any impact, the desired impact on the economic recovery, whether right set of people have been benefiting or not. Professor Undi has been really discussing on the issues of migrant workers and the unorganized workers. I think we can't have any better person than Professor Undi to really introduce and welcome Professor Rao. So I request Professor Jimal to please welcome Govind Rao sir, and we can begin then.
Thank you, Himani. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Govind Rao, who I'm meeting online after a long time. So we at Ahmedabad University welcome Dr. Govind Rao to this edition of the Conversation series, and he will be speaking on COVID-19 crisis and responses of the Indian government. Professor Rao was a member of the 14th Finance Commission. He has served as the director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, and director of the Institute of Social and Economic Change, ISEC. Both are premier research institutions in economics in India. He has been on several committees on the state and central finances. He was also a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India around 2005. He has been a consultant to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, and the UNDP. Currently, he is a member of the advisory board of many premier institutions in economics and management in India. In his research, he has been raising concern about the federal structure of India and the state's fiscal autonomy. He is currently writing extensively on central and state role in managing the COVID-19 pandemic, which is what he will be talking about today to us, and suggesting action plans for economic recovery. He is a member of high-level committees of the Punjab and Tamil Nadu state governments to assess the impact of the pandemic on various sectors of the economy and to suggest the fiscal stimulus package, and also to develop a medium to long-term recovery strategy of the state. So we hope to hear a lot from Professor Rao about the pandemic, its impact, the fiscal impact, and the states, what are they doing about this. So Professor Rao is obviously the best person to talk about fiscal issues in the time of the pandemic. Thank you, Professor Rao, for accepting our invitation. Dr. Himani Bakshi will be holding this conversation with Professor Rao. Dr. Himani Bakshi holds a PhD in economics from MS University, Baroda. She teaches courses in finance, public policy. Her research work includes issues on Gujarat's fiscal performance, and she has submitted research reports on these issues to both the 14th and the 15th Central Finance Commissions. She's obviously the best person to converse with Professor Govinda Rao today. As Himani has said in her introduction, at Ahmedabad University, we run both BA and MA economics programs. We also have UG and PG programs in management and in commerce in our management school. Ahmedabad University encourages interdisciplinary teaching and research. Our pedagogy style is also influenced by interdisciplinarity. We are glad to see that a large number of students and faculty from various disciplines have registered for this conversation series with Professor Govinda Rao. I'm sure we will all learn from this conversation. Over to you, Himani.
Thank you, Professor Jiwal. Yes, I would not like to interrupt now. I think the first issue that probably we can discuss is that a lot of confusions that are going around in our mind about this number, the 20 lakhs crores economic package. Can we really call it fiscal stimulus? Is it really going to boost economy? So Professor Rao, if you can really throw a light and tell us the nitty-gritty and the number jugglery into this.
Thank you, Himani, and thank you, Professor Unni, for that very generous introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here talking to you. I would have loved to be physically present, but then the times are such that you can't be physically present. But nevertheless, I think ideas can be transmitted, ideas can be exchanged, ideas can be debated. The crisis that has hit the economy, in fact, if somebody had asked us in the beginning of February, we wouldn't have known that this would be such an unprecedented problem. And most of us really didn't take note of the problem until it started striking us, although in other countries it had already made the mark. So it struck India relatively late. It's unprecedented. In fact, we can't think of a similar crisis in living memory. People talk about the Spanish flu way back in 1922. And obviously, the entire economy came to a standstill after the complete lockdown on March 25th. There has been a disruption on both the supply and the demand side. In most other crises, you see either the demand problem or the supply problem, but here you have both the demand and supply problem. And in fact, what really happened was the sort of dramatic reference by the Prime Minister in his speech saying that the Mahabharata war was won in 18 days and we will win this war in 21 days. Now, people believed that. And many people thought that this is a short-term phenomenon, and so there was no panic immediately. But then when the thing didn't happen in 21 days, when they started extending the lockdown, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And most of the vulnerable sections, particularly the migrant labor, did not have the reserves. And in fact, you see, they earn the money and send it to their homes. They didn't have the reserves. when they didn't have the reserves, when there is no certainty, when there is no income, there is no possibility of an income in the near future, then obviously there was a panic, and people, it finally led to almost a complete chaos in the system. And of course, even the state governments were struck with the sudden lockdown. So there was not sufficient thinking on what is going to be the consequence. So obviously, saving lives became a much more important issue than livelihoods. But over a period of time, and then of course the time was also necessary for the immediate ramping up of the healthcare sector, the PPEs, the beds, the ventilators, and the testing kits, and what have you. And then of course they gave some immediate relief on March 26th in terms of distributing food grains and things like that. But much of the fighting had to be done at the state level. I'll come to that particular issue later. So when you really are talking about the stimulus, you should also talk about what is the capacity of the state to give the stimulus. Unfortunately, the pandemic has hit the country at a time when the economy was sharply decelerating. Now, obviously the growth rate has been declining over a period of time. Now, in that particular environment, there was, and in fact, the capacity in every sense of the term. We did not have the capacity to foresee the consequences of the actions that we undertake. There was poor healthcare facilities, and there was the healthcare infrastructure, because there has been a historical neglect of the healthcare sector by the states. And then, of course, the capacity to enforce the lockdown itself is a problem. And there is a problem of capacity in terms of distributing the livelihood support to the people who have to get it, the targeting them. And then management of the migrants. In fact, that's where the capacity came much more. But the biggest problem is the low capacity of the state in providing the stimulus. In fact, if you see, the United States and most of the other Western world has given substantial stimulus. Whereas here, there is a huge problem, because as I mentioned, the economy has been slowing down. In the last quarter, growth was 3.1%, and the whole year growth was just about 4.2%. And this 4.2% for 2019-20 was 11-year low. So obviously there is and on top of it, there is three balance sheet problems. You have the problem of the balance sheet of the corporates, problem of the balance sheet of the banks, and the balance sheet of the government. In fact, you see, if one has to look at the balance sheet of the government, the fiscal deficit, the recorded fiscal deficit in, budgeted for 2011-12 is 3.5%. And at the state level, it is another 3%. But then we have all worked on this, and then we basically knew that if you take the public sector borrowing requirements, the total deficit almost works out to somewhere about 9%, 9 to 10%, if you take off-budget liabilities into account. Now, the problem is, when you have such a large fiscal deficit, there is always a problem. Now, the fiscal deficit itself is not a problem if you have a large household sector financial saving, because when you have fiscal deficit, you borrow money from the banking system. But then if the household sector financial saving is high, then there is no problem. But household sector financial saving, net financial saving is just about 7.5%. And when household sector financial saving is just about 7.5%, if the government itself and the public enterprises take away 9%, there is very little of money that is left for the private sector to borrow. But in any case, as I said, the private sector has also not been borrowing. So, and then of course, from time to time, you have been having liquidity, problem of liquidity. Are you there?
Yes. We are able to hear you.
Okay.
Sir, it's going
there
good.
has been a problem of liquidity. And so you have, you have a huge problem. Now that the pandemic has struck, what is likely to happen is that there will be a sharp decline in the center's revenue to the tune of almost something like, if you assume, the people have been talking about, the contraction in the economy, the contraction starts from 4.5%, which was talked about by the IMF in a couple of days ago, to almost, some people are even talking about 7.5% contraction. Now, we economists have almost turned out to be astrologers, and we are as bad as the astrologers anyway. But the point that I'm trying to make is that even if you assume that the contraction will be 5%, as most people think, that is real terms, and in nominal, in nominal terms, the contraction, sort of there may be a 1% growth or 0% growth. Now, that would mean that your total tax revenue decline by the center would be almost close to 5 lakh crores. On top of it, at the state level, you will have something like 1.5, 2 lakh crores shortfall. States tax devolution from the center out of this 4.55 lakh crore, almost, something like 2 lakh crore, not 2 lakh, 1.5 lakh crore devolution will be less as compared to what the budget, compared to the budget estimates. In other words, this year's fiscal deficit without doing a stimulus is likely to be somewhere about 11.5 to 12%.
That's too high as compared to budget.
That at a time when you have, sort of your household sector financial saving is less. Now, if you take all that money, the only way you can possibly do is, part of this you may have to monetize, this particular thing, monetizing the deficit, we have stopped in 1997. There was an agreement between the Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Finance that in future, the issuing of short-term treasury bills by the center to the Reserve Bank of India to monetize the deficit, that would be stopped. And we have been monetizing the deficit in a roundabout way through what is called the open market operations. But then now, if you don't do it, the yield will go up and the governments will have to borrow at a very high rate of interest. These are some of the implications of what will happen. So our capacity to give, deficit, stimulus is lacking. This is without giving any stimulus. All this 11.5 to 12% that I'm talking about. Now, then of course, the Prime Minister came up and said that there will be 20 lakh crore stimulus. And then if you really unravel the stimulus, in fact, the fiscal part of the stimulus is very much less.
Yes.
If you, in fact, you see, Reserve Bank of India came, in fact, immediately on 26th of March, the Finance Minister came out with 1.7 lakh crores, which had basically some insurance cover for the healthcare workers, the COVID warriors, and then of course distribution of food grains to the people, and that was estimated at something like 45,000 crores. And then they also said that people can withdraw money from their provident fund account, and they also said that if the state government can give money or lend money from the building and construction workers welfare fund, but in terms of and then of course there was some money transferred to, through Jan Dhan account to PM Kisan and the like, but the actual fiscal part of this was very, very little. Except that if you consider that 45,000 crores of food grain distribution as a part of the, obviously the government of India will have to pay to the Food Corporation of India for that this thing. Then came, of course, the Reserve Bank of India's stimulus package. And Reserve Bank of India's stimulus package was estimated at about 8.1 lakh crore. Now this 8.1 lakh crore, 8.02 lakh crore, and that included liquidity support, which basically means collateral-free working capital of 3 lakh crore, and what is called the MSME's fund of funds. The Reserve Bank's thing had what is called reduction in the policy rate, by 115 basis points in 2 installments, reduction in the cash reserve ratio by 100 basis points, and then giving money through through the long-term repo rates and long-term targeted repo rates of something like 50,000 crores, and then some liquidity support to NABARD, SIDBI, and the National Housing Bank of another 50,000 crores, and basically regulatory forbearance, reduction in the policy rate, and then of course reduction in the CRR, and then and then of course some liquidity support. And the entire thing is estimated at about almost 8 lakh crores. And then came the 5 installments by the finance minister, and these 5 installments basically, again, if you classify that quite a lot of it is for liquidity support, which is collateral free working capital for the small scale sector. And then they created what is called the fund of funds, for which the government was supposed to pay 10,000 as a viability gap funding, but the rest of it has to come from it's basically government funding for the fund of funds is 10,000 crores. But then they said that, they said that they will create a fund of 50,000 crores. And then they created some liquidity, a special liquidity scheme, partial credit guarantee of something like 45,000 crores. Now, and then of course, the other major thing is that they said that for the farmers can use their Kisan credit card additional money to the tune of 2 lakh crores. And then there was a loan to be given to the electricity distribution companies, and this was to be given, this loan will be given by the Power Finance Corporation and Rural Electrification Corporation, not from the government. This is from the two public sector financing institutions. But quite a lot of it is going to come back to the government or to the electricity generators, because NTPC is the major electricity generator. Of course, there are other private sector generators as well, because these electric utilities owe somewhere about something like 93,000 crores to these generators. So basically, to facilitate them to pay back, so this loan is being given. And then they created they asked the NABARD to create agricultural infrastructure fund of 1 lakh crore. So if you really look at all the details, then and work out all the details, the fiscal stimulus part from the 20 lakh crore that was announced comes to somewhere about 2.1 lakh crore. Now this is
something. So you mean this is the money people will really get?
No, this is the hard cash coming from the government coffers. It is the hard cash coming from the central, from the budget to for the people to spend. Now this is just about 1% of GDP. Now there is always a question whether the government could have given more. Now, of course, recovery will start only when much of what has happened is enabling the private, small scale enterprises and private, sort of sector, and then agricultural this thing to basically start off when, reaching their capacity when the lockdown is taken away. And then, of course, in order to facilitate them to proceed further, but it doesn't really deal with the demand side. That is the thing. And there is a further problem. And the problem is, you see, there are something like 6.3 crore MSMEs in the country, 63 million. Out of that, 99% are micro enterprises, and almost 3.3 lakh enterprises are small scale industries. In fact, only a small fraction of these really go to the formal banking system. And if you really look at it, most of these fellows had gone out of business during the period of lockdown. And many of them are having the problem of not liquidity. They are now faced with the problem of solvency. And there will be a massive in fact, many of them will go out of business pretty soon because they're not able to really make up, because they're not able to earn the money. And of course, most of them are micro enterprises. They don't have formal banking network. And those are the people who are, who neither get, sort of any stimulus from the various schemes that have been announced, nor do they get any loan because they don't accept this thing. So in terms of, if you really see that the actual fiscal stimulus has been less, there has been a lot of money, liquidity made available to the manufacturing sector, liquidity made available to these sectors when they start production. But then many of them may not start production. In fact, the best stimulus now is, removal of the lockdown. Unless the lockdown is removed, obviously employment will not be generated, and then the small scale industries may not function. So, but then obviously one has to balance between lives and livelihoods, and therefore, that is going to be prolonged. But the basic thing is that's one of the reasons why I had said that, even for the migrant laborers, see, when they go, they will be working on, many of them possibly may be working on Narega. Now the question is, I mean, they were getting much more salaries in the urban areas, and then there will be a lot more of frustration, and there may not be sufficient work that may come. There may be, there may be many other things that may happen in terms of increasing corruption in places, particularly in states, where many of these migrant laborers have gone back. So you do have a problem. So, but then I'm still hoping that at a certain point of time, the government of India will come with more stimulus.
Yes.
Because, particularly on the demand side, I think it is important that particularly the vulnerable sectors, including self-employed, because you see, self-employed workers are basically unemployed. I mean, they are not really self-employed workers. So there is, in fact, there will be some stimulus to provide cash support, direct cash transfers to these and those migrant laborers who have gone back, so that they can make up their, they can live, at least their livelihoods are not really, affected. They can live, and then eventually they can come back to work in the cities. But unfortunately, what has happened is the major cities are the places where the coronavirus, sort of cases concentrated. They are the cities. These are the cities where the employments are generated, and
exactly.
there is considerable amount of anxiety, uncertainty, fear. I mean, there is a fear of contracting COVID. There is a fear of not having, and there is uncertainty about not having livelihoods.
So I think when you're talking about it, we have states like Maharashtra and even Gujarat, Tamil Nadu. These are actually the states who provide greater employment opportunities. These are the states who really contribute greater to the gross domestic product of India, and are the one having a greater hit actually. But sir, when you are saying about this pressure of not having enough money, financial resources with the center, we are worried about the states, because health is a state matter, and we don't know how states are able to really manage their fiscal stimulus, or how, I mean, what do you really, you have been writing a lot, so if you can
you are right, Himani. I think you see in this war, the frontline warriors are the states.
Yes.
In fact, of course, they are the ones who have to do it, because much of the fighting has to be done at the state level. Now, what happened was that, in fact, Kerala was the first one to, enact, first one to act on what is called the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, and start working on that, and gave something like 20,000 crores, support, in terms of the cash support, and in terms of various other, sort of ramping up the healthcare sector and things like that. Now, then came the central government, and then enacted what is called, under the Disaster Management Act 2005, they took over the entire scheme of things and centralized the entire power. Now, public health and public order in the constitution are state subjects. But at the same time, entry 29 in the concurrent list says that prevention and expansion of from one state to another of infectious and contagious diseases is in the concurrent list. So the central government has a role to play, but under the epidemic crisis, under the Disaster Management Act, everything has been centralized, and eventually what has happened is that the states had to basically they had to become basically the agencies of the center, carrying out the orders, coming from the Union Home Ministry. Now, there is a centralization issue on the federalism side, which I will avoid talking about now. But the point is that states' revenues have been hurt very badly, because when you really have the lockdown, you don't really have any revenue. Now, as it is, the state government's revenue handles are very, very limited. Maneuverability is very limited. The only 4 taxes are the important taxes for them. And of course, in Gujarat, you don't even have the 4th
excise. We don't have excise.
Right.
On liquor.
So you have basically the value-added tax, or basically the sales tax on petroleum products, motor vehicles tax, stamps and registration, and obviously the state excise duty. Now, they don't really, what has happened is that, as regards, and then of course the goods and services tax has been centralized through a GST Council, in the sense that these people don't have the maneuverability in terms of determining either the rates or even the management. Quite a lot of it is done through the GST network. Now, and then of course there is this issue of the compensation formula that was agreed upon for the goods and services tax, which basically said that on the 2016 base, they will work out every year 14% increase on the taxes that are subsumed under GST, and whatever is the shortfall from that, from year to year, will be paid by the center. And for that reason, they enacted what is called the GST. They also levied what is called the compensation cess in the GST. Now, what has happened is that in the first two, in 2017 and 2018-19, the amount of money collected through the state cess was, more than what the compensation that they had, they had to do. But in 2019-20, virtually every state had to be given a compensation, because the GST collections did not keep pace with the 14% growth that was envisaged when that was agreed upon at the time. Now, what has happened? So obviously, many states thought that they will get their compensation. But what happened is that in the budget, the Union Finance Minister stated that she will limit the compensation to the amount of money she collects by way of cess. No, this is not a part of the agreement. This is clearly an abrogation of the agreement. But the point is that, now you see, the matter has to be taken up by the GST Council. Now, they have been, at the moment, what has happened is, at the time when the COVID struck, in fact, the compensation was pending since November.
Yes.
And so they didn't really have any money to deal with the whole problem. Compensation was struck. So now what they have done is they have given the compensation until February. Now, but then there is uncertainty as far as this year is concerned. They don't even know what is going to happen. And revenue from alcohol was completely out in the month of March. In fact, the Punjab Chief Minister wanted to open up the alcohol shops, at least to get more revenue. Punjabis like their drinks, obviously. And but the point is that was not allowed. And then, of course, motor vehicle sales were not there. And then obviously property transaction was not taking place. So you had a virtual, in fact, the revenue collections were just about 10 to 15% of what is the normal collection then. And then, of course, in the month of April, things have improved a little. And so on the whole, if you see, the shortfall in the revenue for the states would be of the order of somewhere about 1.5 to 2 lakh crores, and then from the tax devolution is another 1.5 to 2 lakh crores, which basically means that and then of course then there is a non-tax revenue part also, which will be less. On the whole, if you really see, the additional, so they they will be falling short by somewhere about 4 lakh crores or lakh crores or so. Now, one of the things that has happened in the stimulus package is that the state governments have been asked, has been told that we will give you additional borrowing space. According to the constitution, state government can borrow.
Yes.
Within the territory of India. They cannot borrow from abroad. Now, Article 293 says that the states can borrow from within the territory of India, but in the same Article 293, subclause 3 says that if you are indebted to the center, you have to seek the permission of the center to borrow. All the states are indebted to the center. So any borrowing that they have to do, they have to basically, the central government should allow them to do it. Now, what has happened is that successive finance commissions had made recommendation, and the Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act basically mandates that their fiscal deficit should not exceed 3% of state domestic product, which basically means that overall they can't borrow more than 3% of GDP. Though the 14th Finance Commission gave some extra room, saying that if a particular state has less than 15% revenue by way of interest payments, or less than 25% by way of debt to GDP ratio, they can buy 25 basis points, borrow 25 basis points extra. I mean, that apart, basically their borrowing space is just about 3% of GDP. And now if something like 4 lakh crore are gone, almost 2% of the GDP is gone, even the budgeted, in fact, you see, by and large, the states generally keep their revenue deficit in check. I mean, not all of them, but if you see the aggregate states taken as a whole, the revenue deficit is generally zero. Even though in the budget estimate they show much higher,
yes,
but they actually, when the actual comes, they cut it down and keep the revenue deficit zero. And then the entire fiscal deficit of 3% is basically used for capital expenditure. Now, what has happened is that now, if from tax devolution and from their own revenue, if they are not going to get the, there will be a shortfall of something like 4 lakh crores, which is almost 2% of GSDP. Much of the axe is going to fall on the capital expenditure, and then of course there is a much higher requirement for them to increase their spending on healthcare. Immediate
the fiscal burden,
and then obviously looking after the migrant laborers, looking after the vulnerable sections, and in fact Tamil Nadu has been giving cash transfers every 15 days, and just as Kerala, and of course the Karnataka also has come out with certain cash transfers, so that you see they look after the vulnerable. Now the point is, they are the ones who have to look after the vulnerable. They don't have the money. And then the central government comes and says that now you can borrow more. In fact, I made a representation to the Finance Commission saying that it is not, even before the ink of the Finance Commission report is dry, whatever the devolution estimate that they have made has completely gone, away. And center has a much better capacity to deal with the things than the state. So you should at least give something like a 1 lakh crore, COVID grant, this thing. But that was not done. In fact, I don't think they are not even thinking of. In the interesting part is if you look at the Finance Commission's estimate of central revenue for the 21-22, and if you really look at the union budget estimate of central revenue, union budget estimate is lower substantially, and the difference on that account for tax devolution itself is 71,000 crores, even before we bring about COVID.
The COVID grants. Yes,
COVID grants. Yes. 71,000 crores is the difference between the Finance Commission's estimates and the estimates of the Government of India. So anyway, the point therefore is states have a huge problem. They are really, in fact, many of the states have actually deferred payment of salaries.
Yes.
A very interesting part is that Kerala, which is a CPM ruled state, basically has deferred the salary payments for 6 days in a month until September. I mean, it's a CPM ruled state, which basically argues for the rights of the working class and the wage earners, and that they have actually reduced, they have actually deferred the payments. Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and in fact, in Punjab, I was asking the finance secretary. He told me that, sir, we can pay their salary until May, but I don't know about June. That is the sort of
that's the entire circle that the states are experiencing. On one side, they're expected to spend, let people have money in their hands, but then at the same time, states don't have money to really put it into the stimulus.
Yeah.
So, sir, when we actually was looking at this entire paradox or a contradiction that both center and states are experiencing, I think just at last decade, when we had 2008 financial crisis, India did manage to have a fiscal stimulus. So do you really see any similarity, or they were completely kind of a different set of situations and different set of fiscal stimulus that we really could get India out of those slowdown of the financial crisis of the world?
Let me answer this. This is a very interesting question that you have put forth. The crisis of the type that we are facing today has never been faced before. That's very, very clear. 2008 financial crisis did not impact India as much as it impacted many other countries. This is also the second one. But more importantly, in 2008, it was an election year. In the budget itself, there was a massive increase in expenditures by the government. In fact, there was fiscal irresponsibility, I would say, because there were 3 steps that were taken. Number one, they implemented the pay commission recommendations. Number 2, they expanded the scope of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act from 200 districts to the whole country, so all the 600 districts. And number 3, they had a massive loan waiver. All these had to be borne by the budget, by the government fisc. Now, more than that, 3 years preceding 2008, 2006, 2005, 2006, 2007, you had a massive growth of the economy, possibly unprecedented 9% per year growth in the economy, GDP of the economy. And the fiscal deficit was brought down to almost at the central level, 2.5% in 2007-8. So you had quite a bit of fiscal space. So this was an election year. So on February 28th, they announced these major measures when there was no crisis at sight. But then what happened was by July, the oil prices skyrocketed. In fact, oil prices became $165 a barrel. And the government was not really able to deal with in fact, since it is the election year, it could not increase the price of the distillate. And actually, the Lehman Brothers collapsed on September 15th. Now, when the Lehman Brothers and the global financial crisis, contagion spread, India was already well prepared because there was already sufficient demand in the system. And the only major problem was the oil prices. And then, of course, there was an election. So there was a lot of election expenditure. The value and the excise duty on union excise duty was reduced. Service tax was reduced by 2 percentage points. And so combined with reduction in the taxes and reduction and increase in expenditure, there was no demand problem, demand listing. But I mean, it had its impact later. It impacted later in terms of the massive increase in inflation. But then, of course, the thing is that the government came, the then government came back to power. The UPA government came back to power. And then, of course, at least afterwards, they should have, sort of constrained. They should have, put a control over the spending. But then that did not happen. So there were after effects, but then the crisis itself did not create a problem of confidence. there is no uncertainty there. There was no such problem. So the economic growth actually fell down later. But then after a couple of years, there was a one-time money they got from the spectrum auction, and of course but then the inflation rate continued to rage because of the massive expenditure that was incurred. Massive fiscal deficit. But the fiscal deficit, became almost at the central level itself almost 7.5%. Quite a lot, almost 2% increase was mainly due to the oil prices, on account of oil prices. But the other thing is, in fact, the fiscal deficit was virtually doubled, almost 3 percentage point increase over the budgeted figures. So there was a crisis, but then I mean, it was not such a big crisis. India was in a much better position to deal with the crisis, and then there was massive, expenditure increase was done, but before the crisis was done, and then of course they always went on saying that this additional fiscal deficit is all because we gave stimulus, which is not really true. But nevertheless, so there is now, I mean, compare it with today. Your growth of the economy is 4%. Your fiscal deficit is already almost, 9 to almost 9%. Now, so there is virtually no fiscal space for you to really give much larger stimulus. So, and then of course you can't give everything. So you have to keep some powder dry. But then, sort of much more thinking and calibrated approach has to be done. In fact, Rangarajan, who was the original author of, getting rid of this monetization in deficit, he was the Reserve Bank governor, and Monte Ahluwalia was the finance secretary when they had an agreement that in future they will not monetize the deficit. Now, even he, after all the people came out and said that, look, in a situation, in a war-like situation, the most important principle that you follow is that you don't follow any principle. So which basically means that, partially, not this thing, you may have to, monetize the deficit. You may have to increase your expenditures to give more, fillip to the economy, to sustain the economy, the economic activity. But then the most important thing that you are required to do is, once you do that, you will also have to come out with a plan, a very clear plan, that how you are going to control your, fisc over a period of time, and what is the action plan that you are going to have in order to be able to do that. Now, one of the major problems that we have is governments have enacted the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, but then they never adhere to the target set. Now, it's a very peculiar situation. When the markets fail, you want the governments to come and intervene. But what do you do when the governments fail? How do you really deal with the government failure? In fact, successively for a number of years, I mean, in fact, they were supposed to reach 3% of GDP as fiscal deficit by 2008-9. And since 2008-9, they are still struggling to reach the 2008-9 this thing. That's one of the reasons why most of us writing on that basically see that we need more checks and balances in the system. You need to have an institution like a Fiscal Council, which is appointed by the Parliament and which is basically to monitor the fiscal deficit. And so the government, can expand and then should possibly expand a little more, while keeping the powder dry, should expand a little more, and particularly to the vulnerable sections, particularly the migrant labor and their vulnerable sections. And then it has to come out with an action plan saying that by this time we are going to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, because my own feeling is that the fiscal deficit is going to be somewhere about 13 to 14%, and the debt to GDP ratio is likely to rise to somewhere about 85%. Now it's from the 70%, it might go up all the way up to 85%. And if that happens, then obviously, because see, the GDP, both the denominator will go down and the numerator will go up. That's where the problem is. And so when that happens, you will have to you'll have to say that there will be an action plan, or we are going to adhere to this, and then possibly suggest that they will appoint a fiscal council which will basically monitor the deficit, and which will be a parliament monitoring the deficit.
So I think right now all the researchers are also worried about that although all the states have appointed committees and advisory panels to really look at the ways that how can they really manage and raise the funds. So would you be able to give some insights into what really both center and states, apart from what you suggested about a council, how can really they manage, because this is all uncertain. I mean, we don't know when economy is going to recover, and whether it's going to be another round of pandemic attack. We are absolutely clueless on this.
Well, I mean, a number of things need to be done. There are immediate things that they need to do. There are the short-term things they need to do, and there are, so medium and long-term things that they need to do. One is that, I think the state should be given a much greater freedom to identify the hotspots and then deal with the hotspots. I think they are giving it. That's something more important. And then the opening up is the best stimulus, and then wherever that possible, they need to open up, and then possibly we will have to live with the we will have to live with the virus, and then we will have to, but there is always an uncertainty until we really find a medicine for this. Now one of the most important things that the government should do, both at the center and the state, is to pay the medium MSMEs what they owe. Nitin Gadkari comes to this thing and then tells MSME minister that 5 lakh crores of money is, the government of India was and government of India and the state government owe to the MSMEs. Why do you want to keep the MSME money? Because you want to say that your fiscal deficit is small. In order to, keep your fiscal deficit small, you don't to pay what you are required to pay. And whatever is due must be immediately due. They said that they will pay it within 45 days. I don't know. The states are not in a position to pay, but unless and until it is paid, this is the time they need. You see, the idea is you go to the banks and then collect the loans. That is not what is really important. Why would they pay interest on the money they already have? And the governments which are holding their money should really make the payment. And the massive borrowing has to be done, but then they have limited fiscal base. Now, of course, the government of India has come up with a very peculiar thing. They have allowed the state to borrow 2 percentage points more, but then they said the conditions apply. Now, possibly, this is not the time where you do not take a distress situation of the states and impose conditions on them. Now, even the Finance Commission was asked to make recommendations on whether they can give the conditions, because for the first time in the history of this country, conditions are imposed on the states borrowing. Not states borrowing from the government, but central government, but states borrowing from the market. Now, in terms of reform component, they are not bad. I'm not saying that the reforms should not be done. But the point is, there could have been a much better way. But in any case, I think most of the states will be compelled to undertake a certain amount of reforms, which may not be particularly in the power sector, particularly the levy of property taxation, particularly the agricultural reforms. I mean, these are the reforms that, and then of course, the ease of doing business, and then finally the one country, one ration card. These are the 4 conditions that they have put. So anyway, and then of course, you may have to forget about your borrowing constraint for the present. You may have to possibly in the state, the central government has already said that they will borrow 2%, something like 4.5 lakh crore more. States will be given another 4.5 lakh crore, which means almost 9 lakh crore will be, extra, which will be something like, 4% of GDP extra. But that may not be enough as we go along, because the capital expenditure will be cut. At a time when you really need expenditure to be incurred, the states are going to cut their capital expenditures because that's how they can, balance their books. So, but then, so you need to really have a clarity on how much of borrowing you want to do, and then time it well, possibly partially, monetize the deficit so that the yield is kept low. That means the interest rate on which you make the payment is kept low, because future is going to be very difficult. And obviously, in order to get a clear roadmap for consolidation, they need to have a fiscal council. And then, of course, in the immediate context, there must be this is a wake-up call. I think every state government should have a very clear register of the migrants and make sure that they are looked after well. In fact, there is so much of a transaction cost of moving from one place to another, and possibly they need to have certain hostels and certain places where they immediately they should start constructing these, so that when they come in, they don't have to immediately be placed in the roadside shacks. So you need to really work out very clear data on the migrants, their skills, their skill set, and then of course ease the transaction cost of movement. Because this country, there should be one country and one labor market, and you can't be really sort of creating problems for the migrant. So better management of the migrants and record keeping is one of the most important things. And then of course, now what will happen is that there will be massive sort of bankruptcies. In fact, quite a large number of the small scale sector will go. Now, how we are going, and there will be a massive increase in the NPAs, non-performing assets in the banking system, because many of them will not, even with all the regulatory forbearance, when the regulatory forbearance goes, then obviously many of them will have, either before that they will go, or after that they will go. So now we are going to have very difficult time. So we'll have to prepare ourselves for how to deal with the problem. And then obviously we need to really think of our future developmental plan. Look at what has happened over a period of time. The government of India has been spending money through the centrally sponsored schemes on state subjects, and it has been neglecting the idea, things like defense. Now today you have a problem in the borders, but then you don't have the necessary equipment that you need to do it, because historically you thought that you just took defense for granted, and that was a central subject. Instead of that, you went on spending money on many of the state subjects. Now, I think that will continue to do so long as will continue to happen, so long as the electoral politics works. But then the point is that we'll have to basically think how exactly we are going to do the developmental things. In fact, Arvind Panagadia has come out with some interesting ideas in his new book called India Unlimited. Basically how to really retrieve the lost ground. Basically, one of the important things that he suggests is that government should, both states and center, should facilitate something like 6 or 7 large areas, not special economic zones, large sort of free trade zones, where something like 5,000 square kilometers in each of them, where you create the infrastructure, allow the flexibility, and then allow the people to go plug in and then start this thing, and don't go on creating this thing. And then most of these will have to be kept somewhere near the coastal areas, so that near the ports, so that they can easily. So in the ultimate analysis, it is, you can't really go on doing the protectionism. Export competitiveness is very important. Let me stop there.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think in this an hour, probably we have undergone the entire public finance domain, and it's an interesting to really begin with the problem, challenges, and then even having a concluding remarks with the very concrete measures, the solution. Probably that's where we all were struggling in terms of looking at what really can be done. And I think this has really been a very enlightening session. we have been receiving a lot of questions. So what I'll do is I'll read out those questions, and I think I'll start with the very first question, which actually came around 5:30. So the first question came from Tushar ji, and it says that in terms of liquidity, is there a supply side problem, which is lack of money, or it is a lack of willingness on the side of the bank? So I think he's referring to whether banks are averse for providing the liquidity, if I have correctly understood.
I think it's a very, very important question. There is no supply side problem in terms of availability, and there is available, but then the banks are very cautious because they, at the end of the day, they're not sure. It's all said that you can give, but at the end of the day, there is always a fear. So what they do is, in fact, is what I'm told by the bank, some of the people, is that they basically ask the person to submit his balance sheet for the last 10 years. And then, see whether there has been any case where he has delayed the payments. Now, again, sort of they are basically increasing the borrowing limit to the people who are already having the accounts. Now, the point is, many of them may not have borrowed at all. They have been managing, because they are small scale enterprises. Now, to them, when they go back to the bank, they say that, no, since you don't have an account, we can't give you any additional money. So there is a problem. There is always a hesitancy on the part of the bankers to give the money, and the banks are not in the pink of health in any case. So there is, there is a saying that you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. And that's precisely what is happening. In fact, a friend of mine who has a biotechnology firm, and in fact, he told me that he has never borrowed, but then he wanted to borrow. He has an account in the bank, where he had sufficient balance, but he has now withdrawn. Now he wants, and he has been doing banking with them for a long time, but then he's not able to get a loan. So the genuinely needed persons may not really get the loan. That's what I said. True. Many of them, of the 63 million small scale industries, which are not almost 99% are basically very small firms, micro firms, and then many of them may not maybe be borrowing from the friend or borrowing from the money lender and this and that. They may not be really having a connection with the formal banking system. But even those with the banking system, in fact, banks are, particularly now, they are going to be very, they do the due diligence very carefully, because, many of them are they are stressed. In fact, many of the banks are, showing, losses, and they will be very careful, because tomorrow they will be hauled up. The point is that, you see, there were cases where very senior officers of the bank were hauled up after 7 years, 8 years after they retired. So there is this fear of 3 C's. Even though, however much the minister says, the fear of, this central vigilance, this thing, CBI, CVC, and then Controller and Auditor General is always a problem. So there is a problem, but then, very strangely, the banks really have put somewhere about, in the last 10 days or so, they have put something like 3.5 lakh crores in the Reserve Bank of India, and they earn the rate of interest, reverse repo rate of interest, of something like 3.25%. No, possibly 2.75%, because they're not, they have deposit, but then they're not lending.
We have another question. Prince Gupta is asking, should we have another round of fiscal stimulus, and should there be a new sector like medical or something to be covered, or should the older sectors be covered in this fiscal stimulus?
Now, you see, the problem is evolving. The problem is not over yet. We have not been able to flatten the coronavirus curve. And as you know, so we don't know how long this particular thing is going to last. And we don't know what all things, the basic stimulus that you really should think of is, at the moment, is on the vulnerable sections. And particularly the self-employed people, the unorganized workers. I mean, these are the people that we need to do. In terms of the sector, the most suffered sector, if you really see, is most suffered sector is basically tourism, the construction, airlines. I mean, these are the sectors. I'm not saying that they should be given this thing, but as far as the medical thing is concerned, this is a wake-up call. As I said, the governments will have to spend more on the sort of healthcare facility. Even the Finance Commission today has been talking in terms of, I think that's something which we will also have to look at. Basically, healthcare has been historically neglected area, with the total spending, government spending at 1.2% of GDP. Obviously, there is a much greater focus has to be there on the preventative healthcare, so that you don't put much more burden on the curative aspects of the healthcare. And insurance is not the way. Insurance, healthcare sector is a sector where there is a huge amount of asymmetric information. And when you have so much of asymmetric information, we'll always, year after year, you will start paying more and more insurance bills, and obviously insurance premium. And obviously that is not the way to go. So they need to spend much more on the healthcare sector. But when you say medical, I'm talking about the healthcare sector. I'm not talking about, and when you say healthcare sector, it also improves medical education, because you have one of the lowest doctor population ratio. You have to have nursing schools, and obviously these are some of the things that they have to really work out. But the effect of that will happen only in the medium term. More stimulus, yes, we do need. You have to keep your powder dry. We don't know how long this is going to last, and obviously, we can't give all the things in one way. In that sense of the term, this stimulus, they have been quite austere in giving the stimulus, and rightly so.
That's great. I'll move on to the next question quickly. We have a question from Saurabh Chaudhary, and the question is that our foreign reserves have already increased to almost $500 billion US. So can we really utilize those funds for capital expenditure?
Of course, as I said, these are unusual times. In the regular time, I would have said that don't do that, because that is one thing which will give you the external stability. Now, in the sense that even now, it is not just the domestic borrowing. The government of India will have to do much more of borrowing. Say, I've already borrowed from the Asian Development Bank. They're borrowing by the bank that is the new bank that was located in the countries have started, and countries surrounding which is
referring to
Beijing. Yeah,
you're referring to BRICS, sir?
Yeah, BRICS Bank. And then of course World Bank is also lending money. Of course, repayment is not coming tomorrow, but what happens is that if you start withdrawing your foreign exchange, and then at certain point of time, if the inflation rate rises because you have made a huge amount of additional money supply, then the exchange rate there will be pressure on the exchange rate. And when the exchange rate pressure comes in, most of the people who actually put money in our foreign institutional investment will liquidate and go away. And similarly, our NRIs who have put the money here will take the money away. So in order to ensure some sort of this thing, in a limited manner, you can possibly use it for infrastructure investment now, but then you have to keep sufficient reserves with you if you, in order to ensure external stability. So Saurabh, your question is very well taken, but the basic point is that external stability. This is one of the reasons why the credit rating agencies have not substantially downgraded us, except Fitch. It's not substantially. They have only given the negative outlook. FAA, but then one of the reasons is that you have good external reserve.
Thank you, sir. The next question is around cash transfer, and we have two participants. So on a similar point, so Sanjay Mukherjee has asked, why doesn't government transfer funds to people as what Germany did? And Vishakha Apte has a question that even if the cash transfer happens, will people really go out and spend? As we know, cost of living is less than the cost of lifestyle.
There has been a lot of discussion on this. In fact, Pranab Bardhan from Berkeley wrote a series of articles in Business Standard, basically saying that you need to have a minimum, so common, sort of minimum income. Sort of everybody should be given money. Now that is not something which we can afford. We don't really have that much of it. We basically have to do the targeted cash transfers. Now when you say targeted cash transfers, the problem with our system is that with all the things that we have with the Aadhaar and then Jan Dhan account and mobile and all that, we still really do not have a comprehensive database. And when you don't have, many of the people miss out. Now, you see, even you had a PM Kisan. Now, even there, in fact, not all farmers are in the group. So what you will have to basically do is to, again, this is another, for example, most of the migrant laborers that you are talking about, they don't have you don't have a record. And when you don't have a record, how do you reach them? How do you give them? And that is precisely the reason why this is a time where you have to create a proper record. Now that you have, sort of Aadhaar, sort of number, and then with that, you need to create a record for each individual. Now, there are risks, but then for situations like this, risk in the sense that you will have a huge amount of data on people which can be misused. But quite apart from that, at least, in conditions like this, with sufficient safeguards, if you really have the data, we'll be able to do it. Germany was able to do it well. Now, very interestingly, Australia is one country which has done substantially better in this. Now, but then the number of people in Germany is much less than the number of people that we are talking about in India. We are talking about in crores. They are talking about in only a few thousands. That's where the difference is. So, but then I think now I believe that, sort of Tamil Nadu has been sort of making cash transfers every 15 days. So that there are, differences between, from state to state. But then the biggest problem in making this transfer, direct cash transfer, is you don't really have the ability to target it. But if you really now have the if you really see, look at this thing now. Government of India has to come and tell the states that you have to have one ration card for one nation, which means that you have to seed your Aadhaar number to the ration card. Now this is not something which would require a rocket science. Seeding Aadhaar number to a ration card and keeping an POS machine in the ration shop is something which you could have certainly done. Now, if that was, if these are the things that is done, that means you create a record of all these migrant laborers, what their bank account number is and what their Aadhaar number is. See, Aadhaar, mobile and then bank account number, if you really have them, then it becomes easy for you to transfer the funds to these people. Unfortunately, they don't have it, and that's where the problem is. Um, well, I hope this is a wake-up call. They will think about it in future.
Yes. Next question is about, so I'm merging two questions here. Nandini has a question that what fiscal measures can really boost the exports and the Make in India, and this the another, which is on the newly coined word Atmanirbhar. So there's a question that is asked that how can we Atmanirbhar, especially in the short time, to address this crisis?
Well, I mean, I think today Arvind Panagadia has an article in Times of India, basically dealing with the whole issue of whether whether we can continue with the protectionism, and now there is a hysteria that the Chinese goods should be boycotted. Now, Atmanirbhar means many things to many people. Now, we had import substitution strategy until 1991, which miserably failed. And obviously, we said that that is not the way. And then then things started improving, economy started growing, poverty started declining. Now, the basic issue is that you do need to, when you say Atmanirbhar, in my view, what we should do is to sort of gain competitiveness. If you really want to gain competitiveness and export competitiveness, then that is the way forward. And that is not sort of by saying that no, I will not allow that fellow to send it. Now what happens, many of our exports have to have their import content from China. Now, whether it is chemicals, pharmaceuticals, or for that matter, many of the other equipment that we have. So the basic thing is, of course, you need to be choosy. You need to ensure that this thing. But then, we do have, which basically implies that we have to have our own reforms in place to make it, make our particularly land and labor markets with sufficient protection given to the labor. You don't need to have large number of inspectors visiting a factory every now and then. You need to really codify that, and then you need to really minimize the harassment by the bureaucracy. Now, that is one of the reasons why I said, that if you have large areas, because where you have ease of doing business, and obviously our entrepreneurs are as competent as anywhere else in the world. I don't really see why they can't produce internationally competing items. But then we don't. I think the governments have become a problem. In fact, the government is not a solution. That's where the problem is. I mean, I'm not talking about this government or that government. I'm talking about the government in general. Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah have written a very interesting book, where basically they point out how the government becomes a problem in many cases. In fact, yesterday I was reading an article by Milton Friedman. Of course, that name rings many bells to many people. And the title of the article is "Why Government is the Problem," and that is in the context of United States. But in any case, as I said, there is a facilitation role, and they have to really do the. Very interesting part is there's in this pandemic in Punjab, there's a group of industry people are working on what sort of a policy stance that needs to be done. And on the issue of export competitiveness and this thing, when you are talking about fiscal measures, the only thing that comes up to most of the people is tax. Unfortunately, the tax policy is most beaten thing. I don't know how many objectives the tax policy is supposed to pursue. The main objective of the tax policy is to raise revenue. You need to broaden the base, reduce the rate differences, and have a simple and transparent tax system. GST is an aberration. In fact, there are a huge problem with the GST. In fact, I had a paper on that, which is available in the Columbia University website, which there is a huge problem with that, which I don't want to go into. So basically you need to, one of the best thing that you need to do is to simplify the tax system. I'm not suggesting that you reduce the tax rates. Simplify the tax system, reduce the compliance cost. There are 3 costs associated with the taxes: the cost of collection, the compliance cost, and cost in terms of the distortion it creates to the economy. So if you have a simple and a transparent and a low-rated tax system and a broad-based tax system, you'll have much less distortion, and the compliance becomes much easier. So I would not say that add another objective of reducing the taxes for the exporters. That doesn't really help. Then what happens is that there will be lots of people who will conceal things as exports and then want to take the tax advantage. There will be huge amount of evasion and avoidance. So this is what I would say, that sort of there is a role, but then simplify the tax system, make it less bothersome.
Okay, there's one question I think I missed in between, which is about, so Devanshi Jansari has asked a question on monetization of deficit. So she's asking, sir has already answered this. Should RBI begin to monetize the deficit? What will be the process for that?
No, in fact, it is not as simple as that. And you see, because there is an agreement between the Ministry of Finance and, as I said, the Reserve Bank governor. What they should do is basically they have to discuss with each other what should be the volume of monetization that you can do. For the present, they have held it because you see, the credit rating agency were evaluating you, and then they did not want to lose out. But as the time goes by, and obviously the liquidity position is reasonably good, and the yield curve has not really created. When Kerala went to borrow, they had to borrow at 8.96%. But now it has come down to 6.5%. There is a difference between the central government yield and the state government yield. And there is almost, I think that now has come down to somewhere at 0.75% or so. But whatever be it, the monetization is deficit basically to keep the borrowing costs low. So what they have to do is, you see, the procedure for that, that used to happen was that central government issuing 75-day treasury bills. And when they issue the treasury bills, these are directly bought from the Reserve Bank of India, and it pays through new money supply. And these treasury bills are eventually absorbed as medium-term securities. Now, so this is the direct, which means, in fact, you see, if you look at the things before 1991, there was no concept of a fiscal deficit in the Indian budget vocabulary. In fact, they used to say budget deficit. And the budget deficit was, there was all the revenues and then actually borrowings from the market, and whatever is uncovered is called the deficit financing. And this deficit financing is nothing but issuing 75-day treasury bills to the Reserve Bank of India and monetization. And that had continued almost until 1997, when they said that, you see, we need to put an end to this, because that was the time when you had episodes of inflation. Several, if somebody said that less than 10% of inflation is fine. I mean, now we are saying less than 5% of inflation is fine. And the Monetary Policy Committee has said that less than 4% is fine. But whatever be it, the point that I'm trying to make is the Reserve Bank on its own cannot do it. The process is that the Reserve Bank and the government of India has to ask the Reserve Bank that, see, let us do this now, because otherwise, it will ask the Reserve Bank whether it can ensure adequate liquidity in the system to keep the yield curve low. If the Reserve Bank says, yes, we will do it through open market operation or the long-term repo operations or whatever, then obviously they don't need to do this. But there may be a time that may come, say, for example, the economy, if the industry starts borrowing and if the commercial sector starts borrowing, then the time may come when the available funds with the banking system may not be adequate. And at that time, there may be liquidity problems. And at that time, the Reserve Bank of India may have to, at that time, the Government of India and Reserve Bank of India will have to come to ensure adequate liquidity through the monetization of deficit.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think we can now ask participants if at all they have a question and they want to raise hands and they want to, if any questions left. We are close to winding up the session. So you may please raise your hand if there is any question you would like to ask. I think there is one question here, question by Sattva. It says, are the IMF growth forecast for developing nations too optimistic? Developed countries, I think I'm missing on the content. Developed countries has biggest forecasted GDP contractions, while developing countries have relatively lesser forecasted GDP contractions. So, is there
now, let me, I think it's a very interesting question, very important question. When the RBI came out with its February forecast, I'm sorry, when the IMF came out with its World Economic Outlook forecast, they estimated India's growth rate at 1.9%. My good friend, Dr. Shankaracharya, who was the earlier chief economic advisor, in his interview with the current topper, made a very interesting point. He said that I'm quoting him, this is ludicrous and irresponsible. These are the words that Shankar used, ludicrous and irresponsible. Because by that time, everybody knew that things were happening badly. And then here is, in fact, this happened in March. And when you have that sort of a thing, you come out with a forecast like that. Even an astrologer possibly would have said that, see, it would be, economy will contract. So we were worse than the astrologers in that sense. Then what has happened is that every other economist is coming out with the forecast, because it seems every economist has a model in his pocket, and then he comes out, suddenly he comes out with the forecast. But in any case, most of the credit rating agencies have basically said that Indian economy, most of them have converged on negative 5% growth. Now, and in fact, see, yesterday or day before, there was a webinar there was this thing in NCAER, their quarterly projections. They're also coming out with such large numbers. My problem is the following. See, we still do not know where we are headed. We still have not really tamed the coronavirus, curve. We don't know how long this problem is going to last. And in a situation like that, you may say that I have that much of loan available, this much of loan available. But if the fellow is not able to start the work, if the fellow is not able to open, what can he do? What can he do with the availability of the loan? So I think, and there is a further thing. You see, the quality of data that you get in developed countries is much better than the quality of data you get in developing countries. Now, for example, the developing countries have much larger unorganized sector and income that is generated in unorganized sector. You don't really have frequent surveys, and then there is a huge amount of unknowns which basically are done through assumptions, and that's much less in developed countries. So and then there was always this feeling that in the last few years, since India has been growing reasonably fast, China and India will be the leading agents. That used to be the case. So there is a they're not able to fathom the seriousness of the crisis. And there is also one other thing that they also don't want to displease the governments. There is also a political element into the whole thing. I can't believe, we have an Indian and very young, bright lady who is the chief economist of the IMF. And, I couldn't believe that, such a optimistic forecast was made for India. But then, there is no accountability in the system. Now, day before yesterday, they have now said that it's from plus 1.9%. Now they said that minus 4.5%. I would come up, possibly after 3 months, they will come up with almost minus 6%. We don't know. But this is how it is, because, the problem is still evolving, and the forecasts are forecasts. And they are not projections. They are basically some guesses.
Yes. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you.
There are so many questions, but I apologize for not being able to incorporate those questions, both because of paucity of time, and also maybe by scrolling down, we would have missed those questions. But Professor Govind Rao has been writing extensively, and he's been talking extensively on these issues. So I'm sure in future also you will be able to read his views, and I'm sure you will get the answer by reading his work. I think we would like to close the session now. I thank you, sir, from on behalf of Ahmedabad University, our economics and public policy area. I'm sure this, I could really visualize our students actually sitting on the session and the class of public policy, covering every indicator, every variable that we could really connect. I don't want to, I'm speechless, and I really want to I really don't want to summarize this, which initially I thought of. It was a treat to really listen to your session. And we wish we keep meeting you in future. It would be an honor for us, sir.
Thank you, Imani. It was nice, sort of to talk about, whole issue. Now, I've been writing on the subject. Possibly I have written by now somewhere about 7 or 8 articles, including the one in India Forum a couple of weeks ago, and one in Deccan Herald last week. That's most of this comes because people invite me to write. They call me and then request me, and of course many times I have to decline. But then, since one has been in public policy area for such a long time, one doesn't shy away from these, and it's very nice that you invited me to talk to the faculty as well as the students, and so let me thank you for this initiative. It's always a pleasure to talk on subjects which are not really very fortunate, but at the same time, since one has some familiarity, one talks. Thank you very much.
Yes. I also thank all the participants and the kind of questions that have come up. I again apologize for missing out some of the questions. Please keep joining us, because Ahmedabad University keep organizing such conversation series around these issues, and you're most welcome virtually as of now. Hope we all keep meeting, and please be safe. Take care of yourself. We'll take a leave. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.